The quiet life. Mark Saunders always believed in minding his own business. His tiny corner lot in Maplewood was more than just a house. It was the reward for years of sweat at the auto parts store, a place where he and his wife Lisa could finally breathe easy. Their daughter Emily skittered through the backyard in the early evenings, chasing fireflies and laughter, sheltered by the gentle hum of suburbia. The American dream, at least as far as Mark understood it, was alive and well on Willow Lane. The neighborhood itself thrummed with an understated charm. Well-manicured lawns, the distant chop of lawnmower blades on Saturday mornings, the sweet scent of grilled burgers drifting over white picket fences. For years, neighbors would wave in passing, offer a polite nod, and respect each other's space. Nobody ever overstepped. That quiet order changed the summer Jones moved in next door. Mark remembered the afternoon a moving van rumbled up the street, parking in front of the empty house. He watched from behind his front window, curiosity piqued but tempered by Midwest reserve. Jones was a big guy, barrel-chested, with a beard that merged into his faded Red Sox t-shirt. A few dusty pieces of furniture were hauled in, followed by boxes, crates, and an enormous black Labrador that barked at anything daring to pass within 10 feet of the sidewalk. Lisa said they should go over and introduce themselves, bring a plate of her banana bread. It's the neighborly thing to do. Mark hesitated but caved to her smile. The three of them made their way across the small stretch of grass separating the houses. Up close, Jones towered over Mark. His handshake was brief, almost impatient. He introduced himself with the kind of grin that never quite reached his eyes. "Nice to meet you folks. Guess we're neighbors now," Jones said, barely glancing at Emily clinging to her father's leg. Mark offered his best polite small talk. Jones listened, answered just enough to be civil, then glanced away as if he already regretted wasting time on pleasantries. The encounter lasted less than 5 minutes. Back inside, Lisa tried to stay optimistic. "He's probably just tired from the move," she said. But Mark, staring through the kitchen window as Jones barked orders at the delivery guys, garbage can to the curb, and found a torn black trash bag perched on top. The plastic split down the side, its contents leaking onto the concrete. Greasy pizza boxes, loose coffee grounds, and a handful of half-eaten apples. The scent hit Mark immediately, sour and unpleasant. He looked across the driveway. Jones's trash bins weren't out, and the man was nowhere in sight. Shrugging, Mark hefted the bag and tied it up as best he could, dropping it into his own can. Lisa, glancing out the window with a frown, asked what happened. "Probably just a mix-up," Mark said, brushing it off. Next week, a similar scene. Only this time, a little mountain of yard waste, branches, dead grass, empty plant pots, appeared along Mark's fence, well past the invisible property line. The debris lay half in his yard, half in Jones's. Emily's soccer ball landed in the middle of it. That evening, as Mark hauled branches back to Jones's side, he caught sight of his neighbor out front, fiddling with a power drill. Mark cleared his throat. "Hey, Jones," he called out, forcing a smile. "Think some of your yard stuff landed on my side?" Jones straightened, meeting Mark's gaze, his expression blank. "Yeah, wind'll do that," he said. "Sorry about that." His tone made it clear the conversation was over. By morning, a few plastic pots were still there, even after Mark's efforts to clean up. Over dinner, Lisa pressed him. "Shouldn't you say something? Set some boundaries before this gets out of hand?" Mark mulled it over, staring down at his mashed potatoes. Maybe he just doesn't realize what he's doing. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, for now. But it was the noise that finally wore Mark down. Lawnmowers cranked up before sunrise, loud music swelling through open garage doors late into the night. The Joneses seemed to pay no mind to the unwritten rules of the neighborhood, rules Mark had always followed instinctively, rules that kept the peace. When Mark mentioned it, Lisa's smile was tight, uncertain. "We'll get used to it," she said, though doubt shadowed. Jones emerged onto his porch, squinting back. "Dogs'll be dogs," he called. "Can't watch him every second." He didn't bother to leash the animal, only whistled once before disappearing inside. Shoe prints tracked across the lawn for days. It seemed barely a week would pass before the next insult. Sometimes Jones's truck blocked Mark's driveway just enough to make backing out a test of precision and patience. Mark bit his tongue through the early incidents, but did mention it the third time, standing on the sidewalk after work, hands twitching at his sides. "Could you park a little closer to your curb?" Jones didn't look at him. "Maybe if you had a bigger driveway," he laughed, slamming his car door and stomping inside. Lisa began to notice the noise, too. Jones held backyard gatherings most weekends. The speakers turned up loud enough that Emily's bedtime stories were washed away by bass and the low drone of adult conversation. Beer cans and solo cups sometimes appeared over the fence, scattered beneath lilac bushes. One Saturday, when Mark clipped hedges along the boundary, he found a tangle of broken bottles hidden in the grass. He pulled out each jagged piece, anger rising like bile. He wanted to say something, to knock on Jones's door, demand some basic decency. But when Mark pictured the confrontation, he saw only more conflict, more hostility. He tried to speak with the other neighbors about it, testing the waters. Over a mailbox, Mrs. Klein only shook her head. "That's just how some people are," she whispered, voice hushed, as if the mention of Jones might summon him. "Best to keep the peace if you can." But for Mark, peace had started to feel like defeat. He became wary of stepping outside, always scanning his property for new messes, new slights. The air was different somehow. Every day, a little less his own. One autumn evening, Emily came inside, quiet and solemn, her arms cradling a battered soccer ball. "Dad, somebody popped my ball again," she whispered, eyes big and uncertain. Mark hugged his daughter tightly, rage curling up inside him. The things they'd taken on the neighbor's lawn. The most painful blows, though, didn't come from bills or noise. It was the careless, creeping damage Jones and his clan left behind, stripping little pieces from Mark's sense of home. One windy night, a crash splintered the silence. The next morning, Mark found his mailbox crushed flat against the curb. He stared at the bent metal, remembering how Jones's teenage nephew, all bravado and borrowed muscle, had torn down the street the day before, the old sedan roaring with tinny music. Jones shrugged when confronted. "Kids act up. It happens." Every Sunday, Mark and Lisa would walk the yard, cataloging new offenses. A rosebush slashed by a weed whacker. Emily's battered tricycle tossed behind the garden shed. Garden gnomes shattered on the patio. Sometimes muddy sneaker prints smeared the front porch, proof that someone had come far too close for comfort. Mark's tools disappeared from his storage bench, only to reappear days later in Jones's open garage, crusted with dried grass. Lisa's patience faded too. She started snapping at small things, a dirty dish, a forgotten bill. Her smile growing rarer, her shoulders tense and tired. "We can't live like this, Mark," she whispered one night, their bedroom shrouded in heavy dark. "This isn't fair." Mark pressed his palm to her back. I know, but what can I do?" Go to the HOA, the police, anyone. We need it to stop." The words quaked from her lips, quiet but urgent. So Mark tried. He filed a report about the stolen tools and the destroyed mailbox. The officer on duty, a polite young man just starting his shift, filled out a form and promised to look into it, but shook his head when Mark admitted he had no proof. The officer's eyes grew distant. "It's hard when you can't prove who did it. Just keep records, sir. Call us if you see something go down." And so records piled up. Phone photos of crushed plants, a diary of vanished items, even snippets of Jones's late-night shouting matches. But without evidence, no one lived among them, threading its way through even the quietest moments. Mark found he could never fully relax, not at dinner, not on the couch, not even tucked under the covers beside Lisa. Every creak of the house or burst of revelry next door set his nerves on edge. Lisa felt it too, though she wore her frustration more openly now. She barely touched her food. She drifted through the days distracted, her garden abandoned, sewing projects half finished on the dining table. Mark reached out to comfort her in the kitchen one night, his hands gentle on her shoulders, but she pulled away. "Mark, I can't do this anymore," she said, voice trembling. "You keep saying it'll work out, that we should wait, but it just keeps getting worse. Emily's afraid to play outside. I barely sleep. This isn't how our life is supposed to be." Her words hurt, but Mark couldn't blame her. He'd caught himself hesitating too. When Emily begged to ride her bike after dinner, Mark heard the hope in her voice and the fear underneath. He hated what this place was becoming. He hated being powerless. Lisa left the table, her footsteps sharp across the floor. Mark watched her go, hard in his throat. He wanted to tell her he had a plan, any plan, but the truth was he didn't. Not yet. Later that evening, as Mark tucked Emily into bed, she clutched his hand tighter than usual. "Daddy, do you think Mr. Jones will ever be nice?" Mark paused, knowing that easy promises would sound false. "I hope so, kiddo," he said softly. "But even if he isn't, I'll find a way to keep you and Mom safe. I promise." He tucked the blanket closer around her, heart aching with the weight of the situation. That week, Lisa began seriously researching new homes online, bungalows 3 neighborhoods away, starter houses with small yards but high fences. She left printouts scattered on the kitchen table, silent evidence of her despair. The mere thought of moving, of surrendering his hard-won home, felt like a defeat worse than anything Jones could inflict. One night, Lisa pressed the issue over dinner, her tone sharper than he'd ever heard. "Mark, we have to do something. Move, about justice, about pride, about the way hope can unravel in the face of relentless cruelty." Something had to change, and he could feel a new hardness settling inside him, an unwillingness to keep absorbing blows in the name of keeping the peace. The next day, Mark began looking for a way forward. A line in the sand. Mark woke before sunrise, the sky outside a thin gray wash. He sat at the kitchen table while the coffee maker sputtered to life, his mind turning ideas over and over like stones. He knew that running meant surrender, not just of the house, but of their dignity. The memories woven into every room, each blade of grass. Yet doing nothing was worse. For weeks, his family had shrunk away from their own yard, cornered by a neighbor's selfishness and a community's silent acceptance. He needed a plan, something smart, something steady, a way to send a message that couldn't be ignored. Mark started small, logging every slight and offense in a battered spiral notebook. Dates, times, photos, even voice memos on his phone when the music next door rattled the windows past midnight. He called the city about property lines and noise ordinances, jotting down regulations almost nobody else on Willow Lane had ever bothered to read. He began to feel both petty and powerful, a man building a case, piling the stones for an argument he couldn't lose. But evidence alone wouldn't solve their problem. As he raked leaves that Sunday, Mark talked with Mrs. Klein in passing, mentioning the trouble in a voice just loud enough for the neighbor on the other side, old Mr. Bledsoe, to overhear. "That Jones always was trouble," Mrs. Klein murmured, not meeting his eyes. "Somebody ought to step up," Mark replied, less to her than to the cold morning air. He stopped waiting for trouble to come to him. When Jones's dog tore up the lawn again, Mark snapped photos, then printed them and brought them to Jones himself, knocking on his neighbor's door. This time his voice was calm but insistent. Inbox was full. The Neighborhood Watch organized nightly walks that conspicuously looped around both Mark's and Jones's houses. For the first time in months, Mark felt something light flickering in his chest, a spark of hope that maybe, together, they could shift the balance. But even a good plan brings risk. That Friday night, as Mark closed the new gate and switched off the porch light, a beer can arced over the fence, landing by his feet. He heard Jones's laughter, malicious, mocking, the ominous promise of a man who didn't like being challenged. Mark picked up the can, crushing it in his grip. He wasn't backing down this time. Whatever happened next, he'd drawn a line in the sand, finally, and for good. Fallout and unexpected allies. The next week brought its own turbulence, the air on Willow Lane thick with tension. Mark could feel it in the way neighbors eyed each other during evening walks, nervous glances skipping toward the Jones house as if expecting confrontation at any moment. He felt it in his own shoulders, weighted with both fatigue and a hesitant triumph. For the first time, Jones had been called to account, not just by Mark, but by the very community he'd always treated as his personal playground. At first, the Saunders family braced for the worst. Jones was quieter those first few days, almost eerily so. Mark found himself jumping at every sound, waiting for the retaliation he knew was coming. Then, on a windy Wednesday, he spotted Jones tossing something into a neighbor's yard, a dented watering can, clearly not his own. But this time, old Mrs. Klein came out onto her porch with her phone raised, snapping a photo. Mark offered a wave of gratitude when she caught his eye. She nodded, and for the first time in years, they exchanged a smile. But the reprieve was brief. Jones seemed to thrive on tension, pressing up against every new rule Mark tried to enforce. He left his garbage cans half blocking the sidewalk. He cranked his stereo up just for spite. One night, Mark returned home to find a smear of grease along the new fence. Initials TJ. "Move," Mr. Patel began. "But after last week, I'm in. Whatever you need. That guy's been a problem for years." Gradually, the block's culture shifted. It wasn't just the Saunders family standing toe-to-toe with Jones anymore. The whole street seemed to draw itself into a loose alliance. One woman started a group chat, sharing updates about property damage or noisy nights. Another neighbor offered to install a camera facing the street for all to share footage if needed. Still, the pressure took its toll on the Saunders household. Lisa flinched at every unexpected knock. Emily kept her favorite toys indoors, drawing her imaginary worlds in the living room rather than on the porch. Mark, exhausted, often stood at the fence late at night, staring at the darkness between the yards, wondering if it would ever truly feel like home again. But each friendly gesture, each new ally and small victory seemed to stitch another piece into place. Mark realized that the fight for peace, dignity, and respect was never his alone. Every door that opened, every neighbor that dared to speak up, made Willow Lane more like the street he remembered, and less like the war zone it had become. And somewhere in that hard-won camaraderie, the Saunders family found a fragile but stubborn hope. Enough, perhaps, to carry them through the battles ahead. The breaking point. The final confrontation was never a matter of if, but when. A truth Mark could sense deep in his bones. The days grew shorter and colder. The lawns rimmed each morning with silver frost. But tension on Willow Lane burned with new intensity. Neighbors spoke to one another in hurried whispers, eyes flicking toward the sagging fence between Saunders and Jones's yards. Even Emily, once brave enough to ride her bike along the sidewalk, now tiptoed by the window and asked, "Is he out there, Daddy?" Far too often. It started on a Friday evening, just as the last gold sunlight blinked out behind the rooftops. Mark was stacking firewood by the shed when he heard shouts, voices raised in outrage and fear. He ran to the street, heart pounding, to find Jones standing toward them, waiting to see who would flinch first. Mark stared at Jones, jaw clenched. For a moment, the only sound was the idling car and the distant hum of Saturday traffic. And then, as if in slow motion, Jones shoved the broken rake forward. Mark caught it, deflecting the blow with an open palm. The old wood splintered and fell to the ground. There was a collective gasp. Mrs. Klein from her porch called out, her voice firm and clear. "We're calling the police, Ted!" Suddenly, it ended. Jones, winded and red, let the splinters drop and backed away, hands raised. Without another word, he stumbled up the driveway and slammed his door, the noise echoing down Willow Lane. For a minute, nobody spoke. Then the teenager's father stepped forward and shook Mark's hand, his face pale but grateful. Other neighbors gathered round, voices low but supportive. Mrs. Klein offered tea. Mr. Patel rolled his eyes and muttered, "About time someone stood up." When the police finally arrived, neighbors stepped forward to give their statements. A dozen camera phones played shaky videos. Mark stood beside Lisa and Emily, his heart still erratic, but with something new creeping in. Relief, mingled with surprise at how the others had backed him up, how the community had closed ranks, not out of fear, but out of shared principle. That night, the Saunders family sat at their kitchen table in silence. Lisa reached for Mark's hand. "I thought he was going to hurt you," she whispered. "He almost did," Mark admitted, his voice trembling. "But we're not alone. Not anymore." Outside, Willow Lane was quieter than it had been in months. Porch lights glowed. Down the street, neighbors lingered long after dark, talking with doors wide open. Mark looked around at his family and realized, for the first time in forever, that this, maybe, was the moment their luck had finally begun to change. A new beginning. The days that followed the confrontation dawned strange and silent. For the first time in months, Mark awoke without dread gnawing at his chest. The morning sun streaming through the curtains seemed warmer, less threatening. Lisa, drawn and haggard for so long, looked rested, her face softening as she sipped her coffee by the kitchen window. Even Emily, who had grown used to tiptoeing through her own house, giggled as she gathered in the street's atmosphere. Neighbors dropped by, more frequently than before, bearing casseroles and fresh-baked bread as if to mark a holiday. At first, the Saunders family felt self-conscious, Lisa wringing her hands, Mark uncertain of what to say. but the conversations turned easy, natural. Old Mr. Bledsoe showed Mark how to shore up the bent mailbox post, and Mrs. Klein brought Emily a pot of violets for her bedroom window. Willow Lane began to feel like home again. The neighborhood chat blossomed into a kind of digital community center. Plans for a late autumn block party, offers to carpool, reminders about garbage day. People lingered on their porches, waving as children darted by on scooters and bikes. The air, once thick with suspicion, grew lighter, full of laughter and the scent of burning leaves. Most surprisingly, Mark felt his anxieties receding. He took walks with Lisa at dusk, feeling pride instead of fear for the first time since the trouble began. He started sleeping through the night, waking refreshed and eager to tackle the day. Lisa, finding her peace again, planted bulbs along the walkway, her hands in the soil, humming tunes only she knew. Emily rode her bike in wide loops up and down the sidewalk, her cheeks flushed and eyes bright. Their home, scarred but standing, felt stronger than before. One afternoon, as the last leaves fell and the sun shimmered low, the block gathered in front of the Saunders house for an impromptu cookout. Mark watched the neighbors talking, laughing, and realized how much had changed. Standing beside Lisa as Emily raced past with her friends, he felt the weight of the past season finally slip from his shoulders. Mr. Patel lifted a glass in salute. To the Saunders family, who reminded us all that community still means something. Cheers and laughter echoed up and down the lane. Mark caught Lisa's hand, her fingers warm in his. She smiled, her eyes damp with relief and gratitude. "We made it," she whispered. Neighborhood. Window shadowed, curtains half closed. Jones himself kept to the periphery, seldom seen, his attempts at intimidation reduced to little more than a memory. What was once the focal point of Mark's fear had faded into insignificance, a chapter closed. The closest neighbors grew into friends. Mrs. Klein brought cookies and stories during the long winter nights, filling the kitchen with warmth. Mr. Patel and his son helped Mark set up holiday lights, laughter bubbling up as they untangled strings and braved the chilly roof. Even the new family down the street joined in, offering cocoa and building snowmen with Emily in the front yard. Lisa blossomed in this new calm. She taught Emily to sew, hands moving deftly over bright fabrics while Emily's delighted giggles filled the rooms. The bulbs she'd planted began to peek from beneath the frost, green tips heralding the promise of another spring. She repainted the kitchen a cheerful yellow one weekend, humming as sunlight danced off the new walls. Most evenings, Mark paused by the window to watch the quiet procession of seasons. He felt grateful for the stillness, grateful, too, for the strength that their trials had revealed in both himself and the community. Where he once saw only risk, he now noticed resilience. Where dread had reigned, there was now hope. As winter thawed into spring, Willow Lane woke in color and song. The block party spread picnic blankets across the lawns, and the laughter of families mingled with the gentle rustle of leaves. Even old Bledsoe, who seldom left his porch, wandered up with a faded camera to take photos of the children. One mild evening, Mark and Lisa sat together beneath their freshly blooming dogwood. Emily dashed across the grass, trailing friends, their shouts fading into the lengthening shadows. "We've come so far," Lisa said quietly, her hand in Mark's. He nodded, content. "This is what matters," he replied. "Us. Home. And all of them," he added, gesturing across the block. A hush drifted over them, but rather than emptiness, it was filled with promise. The Saunders family had weathered their storm. Now, in the blue dusk and budding spring, Willow Lane was truly barbecues, drawing curiosity and laughter instead of side glances and whispered worries. Mark walked each morning beneath canopies of pink and white, his footsteps light and unhurried. Where anxiety had once shadowed him, now there was only a thoughtful appreciation for the world around him. He grew fond of these strolls, sharing a word with Mrs. Klein, who tended her roses faithfully as ever, or pausing to admire Emily's chalk masterpieces that decorated the sidewalk after school. Emily herself flourished, her early worries forgotten in the gentle security of the street. She made friends easily, her world expanding well beyond the borders of their yard. Now, a little older, she biked to school with a confidence that made Mark and Lisa quietly proud. Lisa's garden became the envy of Willow Lane, blooming brighter each year. She found friends in the sewing circle that met on Thursday evenings, and together they created quilts for new neighbors and anyone going through hard times. Laughter drifted from the Saunders porch long after sundown, just as it once did in Mark's childhood home. With time, the drama that once engulfed the block became just another story, retold at cookouts and on slow Sunday afternoons, always ending with a quiet smile and a sense of how far they'd all come. One breezy afternoon, Mark sat on the porch, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands. He watched the neighborhood children, some new, some familiar, chasing each other beneath the budding cherry blossoms. For a moment, all was still except the heartbeat of the lane itself, a rhythm of laughter, care, and indomitable hope. He felt the roots he'd put down spread deeper, unseen but strong. Lisa joined him, settling beside him with a contented sigh. "It's a good life, Mark," she murmured. He glanced at her, his heart full. "It is," he agreed, "and it's ours." Together they watched the golden evening spill across Willow Lane, a place built on the strength of family, the comfort of community, and the kind of courage that grows quietly and patiently into belonging. And so life continued, peaceful, steady, and real. Mingled in driveways, waving beers and lemonade, grilling corn and burgers. There were new children, weaving through the crowd as full of mischief as Emily once was. Some families bore no memory of Jones, or the battles that had once divided the neighborhood. Others remembered, but spoke of those days now as old lessons, not wounds. Mark stood at the edge of his yard, soaking in the soundscape, the thump of a basketball, children yelling, the distant trill of a lawnmower. His own hands, once clenched by worry, now rested easily in his pockets. Lisa squeezed his shoulder as she joined him, eyes sweeping fondly over the scene. "Can you believe how far we've come?" she asked, her voice a mixture of wonder and nostalgia. Mark smiled, remembering lonely nights, tense mornings, old fears that seemed to belong to someone else now. "We've built something that lasted," he said. "Not just for us, for everyone here." They watched as Emily, carefree and confident, pushed a giggling child on an old tire swing, one that Mark had fixed and repainted during another summer. The block party was in full swing, the neighborhood a patchwork of backgrounds and stories, everyone adding something to the whole. Later, as twilight settled and fireflies blinked in the still air, people lingered on porches, stories drifting freely among families. Emily sat with Lisa and Mark, feet curled beneath her, sharing stories from school and plans for the future. She traced the rings of the old porch table, her voice soft. "Do you remember how hard it was, back at the start?" Lisa and Mark traded a long, meaningful look. "Yes," Lisa said quietly. but every hard part brought us here. Emily nodded. I always felt safe, even when things were scary. That's a gift. Mark swallowed, emotion rough in his voice. We did our best, and so did everyone else. As the party faded and families drifted home, Mark stood for a moment in the deepening dark, the porch light glowing gently behind him. He thought of roots, of storms weathered and joys hard won. He thought of time, not as something to be feared or hurried, but cherished. Willow Lane, with all its imperfections and trials,